appreciate you being here. And with that, I'll turn the time over to Congressman Labrador. You know, I'm actually going to keep this speech short, especially after that introduction about politicians. I feel like I need to stand up here and say, I'm Raul Labrador and I'm a recovering politician. But it's an honor for me to be here, and I am going to keep my speech short. We had some technical difficulty and we've already had 20 minutes go by, so I want to hear from you more than I think you want to hear from me. I want to hear your questions so I can answer them. I just want to tell you thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to serve the people of Idaho and Washington, D.C. It's because of this group that I think I'm here. You guys, at a time when most people in Idaho didn't believe I could win, the Tea Party of Boise went out of its way to help me in my election, in the primary, and then you were instrumental in the general election. So I want to thank you for the work that you did, and it's really an honor for me to be back in Washington, D.C. Some of the things that we heard about what the Tea Party stands for are the same things that I stand for. Limited government, responsibility, and honor in the things that we do. We've had an interesting week as we've watched one of our colleagues do something that probably shouldn't have been done. It's a shame that we're talking about that right now. But I do want to give you some hope. The majority of Washington and the majority of the people that are there, especially this freshman class that was elected with me, are not doing those things. They're actually making the right decisions and doing the right things, making the tough decisions that need to be made so we can actually change the way things are done in Washington, D.C. And I think you should be proud of the people that have been sent back to Washington with this freshman class. There's 87 of us, and I would say a large number of us are really excited about doing things in a different way. And I think so when you see these things, I know there's a lot of hopelessness and there's a lot of despair because you think that's what happens every single day in Washington, D.C. I would dare say that it's the opposite. That the majority, if you think about it, out of 435 people in the House, out of 100 people in the Senate, you take any business where you have 535 people together, you're going to have one or two bad apples in every one of those businesses. So don't become disillusioned just because you see things like this happening. Actually become hopeful because people like yourselves have sent people like myself back there to do the right things and who understands that the most important things are our family, our God, and our country. And I think that's what we need to understand and we need to remember, so don't lose hope. Now, it's been an amazing 6 months. There's been some frustrations. A lot of people ask me, what's been the most frustrating thing for you in Washington, D.C.? And it's kind of a funny answer that I have because I think about it and I think, well, I should be surprised, or what's the biggest surprise? I should be surprised or frustrated by these things because there are things I knew about before. But it still surprises me and frustrates me that they're happening to the extent that they're happening. And what I'm talking about is how difficult it is to enact any kind of change in Washington. I knew intellectually when I went back to DC that this was going to be difficult. I knew intellectually that things move slowly in Washington, D.C. And I knew intellectually that there's a lot of people there who don't want any change. But emotionally, I don't think I was ready for it because I owned my business for 10 years. And in the morning, if I had an idea in the morning about something that we could do in my business to improve, it was enacted by the afternoon. It was something that we just got it done and we just went ahead and we said, these are the changes we need to make in the office, and it happened. Well, you have a bunch of people who, like myself, say these are the things that need to change in Washington, and there's a large number of us that are all saying the same things. But yet, when you get through the process, nothing changes. And that to me is more frustrating than what happened this week with Anthony Weiner. You know, that to me is more frustrating than anything like that because I think you guys elected us to make significant big changes to the way things are being done in Washington. And that's not happening. Now, one of the reasons is our fault. Another reason I have to say that there's a problem with the perception that the American people have. And I want to talk about some facts and figures here, some things that I have learned. Unfortunately, you're not going to see it, but just picture up here a big graph, okay? It's a pie graph. It's a beautiful pie graph, too. It's probably the most beautiful pie graph that you have ever seen, all right? And this talks about mandatory spending versus discretionary spending. I don't know about you, but before I went to Washington, I had no idea what mandatory versus discretionary spending was. You hear those terms all the time, but why is anything mandatory? I mean, nothing, in my opinion, should be mandatory. You know, it kind of gives you an idea that it can't be changed. And that's the way they treat it in Washington. Well, mandatory spending are the spending items that happen automatically. And that's the largest chunk of this beautiful pie graph that you're seeing right up here right now, is the biggest chunk. So here's a question that I have for you guys. Everybody says, if you ask the American people whether we should decrease spending, whether we should increase the debt ceiling, 72%, 75% of the American people say that we should decrease spending and not increase the debt ceiling. So they're in agreement with me. The problem that we have is that nobody wants to cut anything. You ask the American people, well, should we cut spending in mandatory spending, things like Medicare, Medicaid, other items, and 72 to 75% of people say no. Well, why do they say that? Because they think that mandatory spending is just a small percentage of the pie. And I'm just going to give you some numbers. Our total spending, and really it's unfortunate that you can't see it, our total spending in Washington is $3.5 trillion a year. It's a number that I cannot even understand or comprehend. $3.5 trillion a year. Of that amount, mandatory, so that's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, net interest on the debt, and other mandatory spending, is approximately 60% of that pie. So if we want to get rid of our debt and our deficit, you have to touch all those items. It's impossible for us to do it without actually touching all those areas. The rest of it, what everybody wants us to cut, they say foreign aid. Why don't you cut foreign aid? Who knows what percentage of the budget foreign aid is? 1%. So if we got rid of foreign aid right now, would that solve the problem that we have right now? It's a good start, yes. But by itself, we can't do that. We can cut, and I'm all for cutting foreign aid, but we have to be realistic about the fact that we're spending 60% of our budget on these mandatory types of things. Now, under the Obama budget, if you look at the path ahead, we're going to have unsustainable deficits ad infinitum. We're going to continue to see the deficit. Actually, if you look at this chart, picture this chart with bars, okay, and it's again a beautiful chart. It's a beautiful graph. The graph actually is pretty high right now. Over the last 2 years, our deficits have been really high, and that's because we've done all this extra spending, you know, with all the different TARP items and all the different things. The graph actually goes down, believe it or not, under Obama for the next couple of years. But why is that? Because we don't have TARP anymore. We're not doing all these different bailouts. But under the Obama budget, it goes down, and then starting in 2014, 2015, it starts going back again, and it just goes up ad infinitum. I mean, it just keeps growing and increasing and increasing. Okay. Can anybody see that? Okay. I just want you to get a feel of what will happen if we do absolutely nothing to change the growth of government. Right now, this is the tidal wave of debt. This is how much debt we have in the United States. If you look at this, historically, the amount of debt compared to GDP has remained pretty constant. Can you see it? I feel like Vanna White now. Can you see that? All right. Actually, Jay, come here. If you look historically, we have actually spent about the same amount compared to GDP, our debt. see it though. The only time that it was really high and it was close to 100% of GDP was during the war. And that makes a lot of sense. During World War I, we spent a lot of money because we were in a major world war. And we were spending, our debt was 100% of GDP. But historically, it's always been around 40 to 60% or something like that. If we continue spending, and this is the chart that scares me and makes me lose sleep every single night. If we keep spending at the current rate, show that to everybody. That's what happens. It spirals straight up. And we start, our debt will become about 800% of our GDP. And that's what I lose sleep over. Over the amount of debt that we're leaving our children and our grandchildren. You know, and anymore, I listen to Mike Crapo speak. You can put it here. And, you know, some people have accused me sometimes of using hyperbole, you know, of exaggerating things. But you listen to somebody like Mike Crapo, who is usually a pretty low-key, calm guy. And he says, we can no longer talk about the debt for our children and our grandchildren. We need to start talking about the debt that we are going to incur. We're going to have to talk about our futures. We're not just any longer worried about the future of our children and grandchildren. We need to start being concerned about our own futures. Whether we're going to have the same country, the same liberties, the same abilities to do things as we have always had. And that to me is really, really scary. And that's the battle that we're in. And that's it. You missed those beautiful graphs that we had. But that's what I want to leave you with. I am hopeful because I think there's good people in Washington, D.C. that are willing to make the tough decisions. But I'm concerned and frustrated because I don't think that enough people understand the gravity and the magnitude of the problems that we're in. And I think we need people like you to send messages. I know you send messages to my office and we respond, but I think for the most part we're in agreement with most of the things that we're doing. But we need the rest of America to kind of wake up to the things that we have to do. And I think that's what we're trying to do. We have a small coalition of freshmen that I think are trying to make a difference, and I hope that together we can do that. And with that, I'm just going to give you guys time to ask questions.